Welcome to Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. On this podcast, we journey through the devastating experience of the death of a child. Grief is seldom discussed openly in our culture, and the death of a child makes people feel even more uncomfortable. We approach the topic openly and honestly, speaking to people who have lost loved ones and experts who help care for them. Whether you are a parent experiencing loss or someone who wants to support another going through this tragedy, this podcast strives to offer hope and help.
Welcome to episode 152 of Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. I'm Marcy Larson, Andy's mom. I am super excited to introduce you to today's guest. And it's not just because her last name is Larson, although that does make it a little bit more cool. But I have to tell you, Ninette Larson is an amazing woman. Her grief journey started decades ago with the death of her son. But what she has gone on to do is quite amazing. You know, this is quite high praise, but as all of my regular listeners know, I love Gwen Capshaw. I feel like Gwen knows more about grief than anyone I have ever met in my life. Gwen was there from the first days after losing Andy, and over the years has become a good friend and has taught me so much about grief. I would put Ninette on the same playing field as Gwen. I feel like they both know so much about grief. I could talk to Ninette for hours and hours and just glean information from her. So I know you are going to absolutely love listening to her today. And it may be that I'll have to have her back at some point in the future because I just feel like she has so much to offer. So I know you're going to really enjoy listening to Ninette, Erick's mom. Thank you so much, Ninette, for coming on the Always Andy's Mom podcast today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm very excited to have you on. So we have another Larson on, kind of a Dr. Larson. We can give you an honorary doctorate. You have your master's degree in a licensed psychotherapist, you said. But the coolest thing about you is the fact that your son's name was Erick Larson, the name of my husband. I feel like this whole conversation was completely meant to be only because of Erick Larson and Erick Larson. What are the chances of that? And you know what's funny is that I did not know a lot about Ninette's story. We were introduced by a mutual friend who said she will be great on your podcast. And we've spoken for 10 minutes before starting recording, and I can tell you she's going to be great on the podcast. So welcome, Ninette.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here.
Absolutely. All right. Well, why don't we start out by talking about your little baby, Erick Larson?
Erick was my only son, and it was 35 years ago. I never in my life, like most mothers, experienced that kind of love. I never, nothing in the world was like it. It was, I don't know, something beyond joy.
Yeah.
And he had problems at birth, but they seemed to be getting better. And I had 6 months with him.
Yeah.
He died SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, actually at the babysitter's.
Wow.
The morning before I took him to the babysitter, I remember just staring at him and saying, I love you so much. And afterwards, I was so glad that was the last thing I ever said to him.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, when I found out by telephone that he had stopped breathing, which is what the babysitter said, I certainly, like most of us, thought, well, okay, but has he started breathing again?
Right.
We don't take it as, this person's died. It's just like, this is what's happened. And now what are we going to do about it? Right.
Right.
Then there were wonderful people. I was very, very fortunate to have wonderful people around, a nurse that lived close by that came to help, and then calling on my family when we went to the hospital. And actually, something at the hospital was interesting too. I immediately wanted to find someone that knew what it was like to have a baby die.
Yeah.
And I asked, the medical people, is there someone that's had a baby die? Well, a nurse came and she said, I haven't had a baby die, but my mother had 5 babies die before I was born.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave me some kind of hope and courage.
Yeah.
That her mother had been able to deal with this horrendous pain 5 times and didn't give up. And here was this wonderful person standing in front of me that survived. I think it was the best thing I could have heard at the time.
Right.
It just gave me hope or human resilience or something, And then I just wandered in what I now call the wilderness for many, 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 many months.
Yeah.
And ended up going back to graduate school
because
I wanted to. Well, actually, that was another story. I went to a therapist.
Right. Yeah. You went to a therapist
who wouldn't let me talk about my son. Creepy.
Yeah.
She kept changing the subject. She had young children herself. So it was very scary for her, I'm sure, to listen to me talking about my son dying. And so I just took her to lunch and said, would you tell me how to become a therapist? I mean, if she had been a good therapist that knew about grief, maybe I would never have gone back to graduate school and become a therapist.
Isn't that funny? That it was just because you had someone that was so ill-equipped to handle it that it made you think, okay, maybe I could do this. I could probably do better than her.
No, that it just happens. In fact, the woman I went to look at graduate schools, I went with another woman who was also looking at graduate schools. And at some point I talked to her about my son, and she just totally stopped talking for like 10 miles, 15 miles home. I thought, oh, shoot, I shouldn't have brought it up.
Right.
And then when she got out of the car, she said, well, I've never told anybody this before, but my brother died when I was a child. So what it did was my being able to talk about grief, which is still a very hard thing for people to do because the world out there doesn't understand. It allowed her to finally talk about this grief that has sat in her for like 30 years.
Wow.
So, the world so needs to talk about grief. It so needs to know about. I mean, it's been my passion ever since.
Yeah.
I ended up going to graduate school. I ended up ending up at a place that halfway through my program, they started a grief specialization. I was the first graduate of that program.
Oh my goodness.
Everything I've done has been like, no, we can't do this, or and then finally finding in the inner city, getting a job, and the teachers were asking for a grief specialist because so many people have been killed on campus. I mean, and it's horrible in the inner city. I went in the second grade classroom, asked if anybody to raise their hand who'd had someone they loved die, and they all raised their hands.
Wow.
And then I asked them my grief question: do any of you feel like it was your fault that they died? And they all raised their hands.
Oh.
In fact, a little boy, I asked him, well, why do you think it was your fault? And he said, because my cousin was born on my birthday. And in his little mind, there wasn't room for 2 people to be born on the same day. He didn't have enough life experience to know that there are millions of people and lots of people have the same birthday. And so he thought that his cousin had died because he already had that birthday. And I was able to reality test with him that there were more than 365 people in the world that have, and so the birthdays get shared. But that was one of the most powerful things I ever did, because I think I had like 30 kids stop feeling guilty so I didn't have to feel it the rest of their life.
Yeah.
Which becomes all kinds of psychological problems. So anyhow, I went way beyond Erick dying. Erick was very, very sweet, and there's a hole in my heart, and he's always in my little hole.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing what, those horrible things that happen can end up turning into something beautiful and productive. It's hard to envision that right away, but it can be a beautiful thing. I mean, obviously, I would have never done the podcast. I would have never met the wonderful, amazing people I've met over these last 4 years. Had Andy not died, I'd take him back in a second.
Yes.
In a second, I would.
Yes.
And give it all up.
Yes.
But because I can't, I'm glad I can meet amazing people doing amazing work.
Yes. No, same thing. My work has been my passion, and it hasn't stopped being my passion for 35 years, but I would take him in exchange in a heartbeat.
Yeah. So you talked about seeing that guilt in all of those kids. Do you feel like that is just something that you see universally?
Absolutely universal. I've probably worked with about 1,000 people in grief now, and I have yet to meet someone that doesn't get stuck in some aspect of guilt. Mm-hmm. I call it ooey gooey guilt. It's the stickiest thing. It gets us stuck. It comes in various ways. Every week I hear another version of the guilt, another layer of the guilt. And then when someone finally starts going back in life and getting their energy back and being able to be more than the grieving mom. I mean, I remember when it took me about 4 years to stop my identity being the grieving mom, and I got to be more than that. Mm-hmm. When we get to a place where we're not grieving as much, we're not in pain every day, then we feel guilty again.
Yeah.
This it's like layer and layer and layer. There it is again.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It is just an overwhelming thing. And it's so funny because everyone just tells you that it's kind of silly, that you shouldn't feel guilty. There's no reason for you to feel guilty. And that does not help.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to admit, probably for a year or so, I don't know, way back, I would tell people they shouldn't feel guilty because I knew it got people stuck. And I thought, wait a minute, you cannot tell people not to feel their feelings. The most important thing in grief is to feel our feelings and let them move through us. It's not to hold on to them, but if we don't feel them, they'll be stuck. That's why we have to feel these yucky feelings we wish we didn't have to feel. But, the pain is the healing. And feeling the feelings is the healing. I wish it was otherwise. I have never found it to be otherwise. And what we want to do is move through it so we can let it move on and not get stuck in us.
Yeah. And that's, I think, a lot of our fears is getting stuck. I mean, we see people that are stuck, and then I think, I don't want to be that person. How do I keep from being that person?
And I think it's extra hard because people don't know what stuck grief looks like, right? Mm-hmm. And we have this new diagnosis that came out of prolonged grief, which I have two feelings about.
I want to know what your feelings are about it, actually. I've got some kind of strong feelings about it.
I've had my first strong feelings are no.
Yeah.
But my second strong feeling was, oh my gosh, this is the first time the DSM-4, which is a diagnostic, or 5, 6, or whatever they're doing now, is a diagnostic manual that therapists have to use to diagnose mental illness of all kinds, right? So so people can get reimbursement from their insurance company, essentially. Right. And you used to we had some others diagnosis that didn't have the word grief in them that we'd often use, but grief has never been in the book, which is also, first of all, it's not an illness, but it is real. And it does have real symptoms. And those symptoms look like a lot of other symptoms. They look like depression. They look like anxiety. They look like so many things. They can even look like OCD because we want to control things. They look like many things. The thing is to separate the grief from these other diagnoses. And it is true that if we don't deal with our grief, if we don't work through it and process, it's something that has to be processed. If we don't do that and it gets stuck, it will become anxiety and depression. And then you need to deal with that. And there's often a lot of trauma, and trauma gets stuck easily. Trauma almost generically gets stuck. It's a stuck thing.
Right.
And there are ways we can process that trauma that then allow us to do the grief that we need to do. But grief is a real thing. I'm glad they've said grief is a real thing. That part I like.
Right. I do too.
But the fact that they said 6 months to a year, no.
Right. And if it's outside of that, then there's something super wrong with you. That I don't like.
It's wrong. And most of the grief leaders in America that had tried to have some input on this really thought it. We're really not happy. When first they came up with 6 months and they said, no, we're not going to approve that.
Right.
And it was a compromise to say 12 months. But we all know that have been through major grief, especially the loss of a child, knows there's millions of changes and feelings to get through. How could you do that in a year?
You can't.
It's too much. It's almost like every cell in our body has to change. Our personality has to change. Our priorities change. Meaning in life becomes a big deal. We have to reinvestigate all of that. Who are we? We have to forgive ourselves for being powerless and imperfect parents, which are supposed to protect our children. We're all imperfect parents. I have never, ever met a perfect parent. It's simply something that wasn't built in our genetic code. We don't have that ability.
Yeah.
So anyhow, ask me another question.
No, I just want to go on about that a little bit because I agree with you. The year thing was what really bothered me the most. I do like that they are acknowledging that this is a big problem and people need help with it. And if now making a diagnosis so people can get their therapy covered by their insurance plan and things like that, if that will help with that, great. But when they do things like you should be, kind of be better at a year and put those time limits on things, well, that's going to make people feel even worse because for the most part, most bereaved parents I've talked to, especially bereaved moms I've talked to, have said to me that after the first year, in many ways, things were kind of worse. Because you go through the first birthday, the first Christmas, the first anniversary, all of this first, and you expect it to be horrible. And then you get to the second and you think, okay, things are going to be better. And more importantly, everyone around you thinks, well, she's been through this one time, so it's all going to be easier now. So the support system isn't there as much. And that actually means it can be harder. So you just barely were able to breathe through the first Christmas. Now the second Christmas, your family wants you to show up. They want you to put up a Christmas tree. They want you to do a little bit more normal stuff. Well, that's about impossible for a lot of people, for me, for sure. And so when they make this diagnosis and put this year thing on it, that is just going to increase the guilt even more. And we already talked about how guilt is huge.
Yeah. It's why the whole world needs to be educated about healthy grief.
Right.
This doesn't help the education, because people already, I know, I hate the stages of grief, right? Because it's inaccurate. It was about
I hate that too.
Death and dying. It wasn't about grief to begin with, and it's been cemented. It's in tests when you get your degrees, and it's incorrect. There's actually a cycle of grief, and we go through it numerous times, and grief is like a a wave. It does all these things, and it's different for everyone, right? We get triggered by different things. We are changing in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
If it wasn't so painful, which it is,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no way to get around that, it's an exploration.
Mm-hmm.
We go into what I call the wilderness from what we call the old normal. And in that wilderness, we have to learn to trust ourselves. There are few guideposts. And when I do therapy with people, it's to help them see those guideposts so they continue on the journey instead of get stuck somewhere or go way off in the wrong direction that doesn't lead them through. But in the wilderness, we don't even know who we are.
Right.
That's how profound and deep it is grief in general, but definitely the loss of a child. It makes us question how the world works.
Yes. Yeah.
And that ever-present word, why, that if I could extract it from the vocabulary and throw it in the garbage, I would.
But you can't. You can't. And it's just there. It's just there.
I can't. It's ever present. When I worked with kids, that was their absolute number one question about everything. And as adults, we have the same question, except as adults, we think we should be able to figure out why.
Mm-hmm. Right? Because we should have that kind of power.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't. People get little bits and pieces of why. They get a diagnosis that, says, well, this is what the brain was doing, or they get, whatever. But none of it tells us, why did it happen to me? Why did it happen to my child?
No.
The world, in many ways, doesn't make that kind of sense. So we end up having to find a new world with a new sense, new meaning.
And I'm glad you brought up that trust thing, because that has been huge for me, and I know it's huge for a lot of people, is that when you have a child die, whether it's trust in God or trust in the universe or trust in the way that the world should be, is gone. The trust is gone. Parents are supposed to outlive their children, period. And when it doesn't happen like that, you start to question so much and just not trust anything.
Right.
And it's funny that it puts itself out in other directions, but it does, right? I don't trust that. I don't trust that for sure that I'm going to be able to go somewhere next week, right?
Right.
I don't know that.
No.
I had the most horrible thing happen just on our way to a baseball game. We get in a car accident and my son's killed. I can't promise you I'm going to be somewhere next week because I could just die. And when you've had that happen to you, that trust that things are going to work out is just gone.
We have to find a way to live with not knowing.
Yeah.
And that's a huge challenge for human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Grief it's so powerful. It brings out truth. We don't take bull anymore. We just don't take bull anymore, right?
No, we don't. No.
Which is wonderful, actually. And we do a lot of, well, how does the world work and why does it work this way? And with those questions that can't be answered, how can I live with not knowing, right?
Right.
Because that becomes a really big question. What can I do that helps me live with not knowing?
Mm-hmm.
Years after my son died, I got cancer twice. And then recently, of course, there's been COVID, the great unknown.
Right.
Continuing to be great unknown. And by the way, old grief that hasn't been processed I call it the grief closet. We stuff it in the closet if we can't deal with it. Then the closet opens up with every new grief. We try to stuff new grief in there and it all falls out on top of us. So we're not only dealing with the new trauma or grief, we're dealing with the old stuff as well.
It's funny that you brought that up because it was just in the last few weeks, I was talking with my therapist, and my therapist said, I just want to talk to you about what we want to do now, because I think there's a lot of messiness back from when your mom died that you never really cleaned up. She said, I think maybe we need to start there and clean a little bit of that up, because we'd been working a lot on Andy. But I lost my mom when I was young. I was in college, and she died of cancer. And she's right. I mean, there was a lot of messiness there that was never cleaned up. I wasn't in a real healthy grieving family at that time. And
you didn't have support, right?
No, you just didn't talk about it.
Right. You didn't talk about it.
So I just had all of those years of not talking about it. And so then when Andy did die, I really thought I was much more prepared than Erick, because I've been through this before. But it turns out I didn't do it well the first time.
You didn't have a chance to do it. It got mostly stuffed in the closet, right?
It got mostly stuffed. Like, I was in college, and my dad got pretty quickly remarried, and we didn't talk about my mom.
Yeah.
There are a few people I can talk to my mom about, but a lot I can't, and that's not healthy, not great, and it turns out it's not helped me now.
Yeah,
So things are even messier.
Not talking about things for a variety of reasons, because the person that you're trying to talk to is afraid to handle it,
right,
or afraid to upset you or whatever. And as a young adult, see, the developmental stages make a real difference in terms of our grief and the processing of our grief. And in fact, each new developmental stage, we have to reprocess it.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a teenager, you're pulling away from the family. That's your job, right? You go to college, you start your own life.
Right.
And there's this sort of loyalty thing that comes up, or this, abandonment thing that can come up just naturally, right? Or the disconnect. I'm not part of that family actively right now, but oh my God, I love her and miss her. So, and it not being acknowledged, right? Nobody's, in fact, your father not acknowledging it. I'll just replace it. I'll find someone else, right?
Right. I mean, he just didn't know how to do it. I mean, I'm not
exactly
judging him on it. It's just
bad people. Exactly.
Right.
They just don't know.
Yeah.
They just don't know.
Yeah. But it was, I was glad my therapist did that, because she's probably been thinking it for a while. Let's just be honest. But finally to be able to go, so what are you thinking you want to do right now? Because I'm thinking there's a lot that we need to kind of work through that's old. And she's 100% right. But I needed to be there.
There's a great book called The Grief Recovery Handbook. Mm-hmm. And it's still in print. It's been in print for 25 years. I guess they also do workshops or something, but it talks about making a loss history graph, which would be a great thing to do. So you graph out all the years of your life and the major losses and the significance of those losses. And the two writers go through their own as example in doing it. And it has basic information about grief and then how to go through this process, because it really gets you to have a chance to honor those losses that kind of got shoved away. Mm-hmm. Or, oh my gosh, that's why things were so hard at that time, because, all this stuff happened and et cetera. So it's a great, great book.
You said something earlier before we started recording that I really want you to say again. And that was when you talked about the uniqueness of child loss and the feelings that parents have, really kind of a responsibility and things like that. So I'd love for you to tell the audience kind of what you had said earlier.
Thank you for asking. After working with about 1,000 people with all different kinds of losses, child loss, it's not only because I had a child loss, but it's a unique thing, especially the mother. It probably is so for the father, but it's different. We haven't studied it enough. These beings are part of our life, part of our body. I mean,
right.
That's huge. There is something organic that simply exists there. And on top of that, all parents have two main goals: love and protect their children. Everything else is secondary. Those are the two things that parents are tasked to do with their children. And to not be able to keep them alive. It's like, but that's my job. That's my job. How could that be taken away from me? And how could I have no power to do anything over that? There's also forever a hole in our heart. It's literally inside of us. I don't know how else to describe it. I don't know how you would describe it. But there's an actual hole there. If we could take an X-ray, there would be a hole.
Just a piece is just missing.
A piece is missing. A piece of our body, a piece of our psyche, a piece of our energy. There's literally something missing from our body. And so there is nothing. It hurts so much. In fact, the man who helped Kubler-Ross write about grief before she died, she was the person who wrote about death and dying, just wrote a new book. Kessler is his name, and he wrote the 5 stages of grief. I still wish he didn't use that term, meaning making. And he even says it has problems with it. Does, but he still didn't change it. But his son died partway into his publishing that book. And when he's been out talking this last year, he said, I hadn't a clue. He's like one of the known experts in grief. I had no idea how painful it was. He said, I could never have imagined how painful it was. And I trust him much more after he said that.
Yeah, right.
He now knows. Some of my clients come to see me because they know I know,
Yeah.
There really isn't any way to know unless somebody's been through it. And I don't want anybody to have to know.
No.
But it is unique in that way.
It's funny. I was in a book group with bereaved women. So there were some widows and more bereaved moms, actually, but bereaved moms and then a few widows. And we were reading a book that was written by someone sort of local in the Michigan area about grief and death. And we got halfway through and we quit. We just could not read it anymore because you could very much tell that the person that wrote the book had never been bereaved. They were writing about going to Africa and working with kids who had lost their parents and whatever. And they would say stuff and that's just not right. That's just not right. That is somebody looking from the outside and not seeing what it really feels like. And when we had, this group of bereaved women, we would go, chapter by chapter. And then finally we hit, I can't remember which chapter. I'm like, you know what? We're done. We are done with this book. And we did not read anymore. I think I threw it in the trash because I don't know. You need someone that really, really understands, and you can tell when they don't.
Yes. And your radar is precise. That's why trusting yourself is so important, right? We don't take bull. We've been at the bottom. We know what it looks like down there. And some, cute little blah, blah, blah that's going to, work. Just, it's like, no, you don't know.
Yeah. Cause it was a book on how to fix yourself. I can't remember because now it's been a few years. But the other thing that was good is that we did it as a group. And so I would have these things and be like, that just doesn't seem right. And I'd kind of circle it and then we talk about it. And then we're all realizing, yeah, that doesn't seem right because that isn't right. But when you're reading it just yourself, you could start to think, oh, I guess I messed up. I mean, she published a book.
Yes.
So she clearly knows. I don't know. There's something wrong with me. So it was nice to do it in community to be able to kind of call them out on yeah, that's just not right.
It is so important, even though we're in the wilderness and we don't know. It's okay to not know, but to keep trusting ourselves. What feels right? What makes we know what feels right. Our body tells us what feels right. We need to trust that above anything else. Our bull barometer. I can't say the words together, but barometer, our bull barometer, that's very hard to say.
There you go. Yeah, that's hard to say. I'm not even going to try to repeat it.
needs to be up there, right? And,
Right.
yes, we do, because we get so much misinformation from the outside world. We get so much, including this new diagnosis, it has the time frame wrong. It has some of the symptoms right, but it tells you there's something wrong with you. And people in grief, I shouldn't be depressed. I shouldn't, that word shouldn't also needs to be thrown in the garbage can.
Yeah. That's what Gwen, who always comes on my show, she always says, do not should yourself.
Yes.
Don't should yourself.
Yes, it is. We're dumping on ourselves,
Yeah. You have to take that world out of your vocabulary. And I tell kids that. So I'm a pediatrician, so I see lots of adolescents with anxiety, depression, and they all tell me how they should be feeling. And I always tell them, I do not care how you should be feeling. I care about how you are feeling.
Yay. How do you feel?
Yes. It does not matter to me one bit how you should be feeling.
They're lucky to have you.
Maybe just throw that word away. So, and that's what I think all grieving people need to throw that word away. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Yes. We need to honor our feelings. We need to honor, and like you say, community helps. Hearing what other people, how did they deal with this? What was their depression like? What was their anxiety like? What was their healing like? What did they do? What little rituals they did that made them feel more connected, right? And you think people also think that we're disconnected forever from our loved ones, but that's not true. We have that. We don't have the physical one, and there's enormous grief about that. They won't be here again, and that is tremendous pain. But we can talk to them anytime we want.
Well, that's true. That's true. I've got to kind of remember that sometimes, actually. And it doesn't matter where I go. I can do it anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Because we know more than these people that tell us what we should be doing now.
Yeah, I know. But it's hard. It's hard when you are feeling judged and feeling other people's, really that judgment. I think it's difficult.
It's really, really hard. And since it's a new thing for most people, it's like, we don't know yet. So it's like, is what they're saying right? They're telling me that's what, and so we try to look to them for answers and don't trust ourselves so much when we're new in it. It makes it even more difficult, right? Like the old sayings of don't talk about it. Well, that's the worst thing we can do about grief. If other people won't listen, write it down, write a journal and listen to yourself with what you write.
Well, and I think that's one thing I love about doing the podcast is I love being able to talk about these things and then know that people want to listen, right? I can't go and have these conversations with people at work because in general, they don't want to hear it, right? So I don't talk about this there. But with you, with other guests I have on, with just the listeners, they want to hear it. And I want to talk about it. And it's beautiful to be able to do that in a good way, right? And not feel like, gosh, I just can't talk about Andy because that's going to make everybody feel uncomfortable and feel weird.
Right,
and whatever.
Exactly. It's healing. It's so healing. The truth is healing. It's probably the most healing thing in the world, but that community and sharing is outrageously healing as well. You said you were a pediatrician, and the medical community has a really hard time because there's this overlay of guilt when someone dies, and dealing with it. That they really need a whole year of medical school devoted to grief. I remember doing doctor's rounds once, and it was so flattering and talking about even, is it okay to cry if a client dies, or a patient dies? And one doctor had to go out to help a C-section for a client, and he came back before the end of the talk because he said, I want to come back. I wanted to come back and get more information. It was like such a great honor for him to, quickly come back after the C-section, make sure he heard more about grief, or the sound technician at a presentation I did after he was just there to do the sound. Afterwards, he came up to me and he said, "Oh my gosh, things about my divorce or things about the war finally make sense to me."
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's those kinds of things that just fuel my love of educating people about healthy grief,
So recently I got a little card from the therapist that used to see Andy. Saw Andy years ago when he was in like second grade. He had pretty bad anxiety and he was diagnosed with ADHD. And so we had him in some therapy, and he would even be like afraid to go down in the basement because his anxiety would get so high. And so they did some play therapy. They actually did some EMDR to help him be able to go in the basement. It was a lovely therapist. She was very, very nice. And I got a card from her just in the last little bit because I was doing this presentation for medical professionals, and she was kind of wanting to go, but she didn't know if it would make me uncomfortable to be here. And she said, "When Andy died, I so wanted to go to his funeral, but I asked people like colleagues if I should go, and they said no. And so I didn't." And she said, "I regret that to this day. And I wish that I had just trusted my humanity a little bit and gone." I mean, she hadn't seen Andy in years. If anyone had asked how she knew Andy, she could have said anything. She definitely would not have had to say she was a therapist. She needed to go for herself. And I mean, I'm glad now. So she follows me, I think, peripherally. And that's why she said, if this happens again, I'll trust my humanity. Because it's a huge regret. And it was from colleagues in the mental health world who said, "Nope, that's crossing a line. You can't do that. You can't go to that little boy's funeral." He died in a car accident. It's not like he died from his anxiety that she had failed to treat him somehow or whatever, right? It had nothing to do with anything. And there were hundreds of people at this funeral. It was, it just would have been something for her. But instead, she sort of kind of watched it online and has sort of been following me a little bit, but too afraid to reach out.
It's this, there's this dual relationship line, for therapists. But grief changes everything.
Right. I mean, she's grieving him. She hadn't seen him in years, but she was grieving him. And it was not honoring for her to not do that for herself. Right?
Well, how wonderful that she reached out to you and that touched your heart.
Oh, very much so. I mean, I'm all emotional about it even now.
Right, I know. I can feel it, which is good. And how good of her to reach out now. It's actually never too late to grieve.
Right.
It's easier to grieve early on. It's easier to not get stuck in it, right?
Uh-huh.
And there's less problems if we get to grieve sooner rather than...
Right. And you get support from other people around you a little bit more, I think.
Right. But I don't think it's ever too late to grieve.
Mm-hmm.
My father had open heart surgery at 94, 92. And while he was recovering, he was fully cognizant. He'd never talked about his mother's death as a child. And the first time my mother said she always ever saw him cry was when my son died. And I asked him questions about his mother's death and was able to reality test that it wasn't his fault. He was 9 years old. He would have had to drive on horseback for 100 miles to get to where she was. The hospital, he would have had no power anyhow at 9 years old, and was able to alleviate some of his guilt that he'd held in for 85 years. So it's never too late to grieve. And grief doesn't go anywhere unless we get a chance to process it. But it just makes our lives so much easier when we're able to do it sooner rather than later. By sooner, I don't mean right away, because sometimes we can't grieve at all in the first few months. We're just surviving.
Right. You just survive. Yeah.
Yeah. But usually people are able to start working on their grief at 6 months or a year. It's
so funny.
Yes. It's like, this is when
it goes back to that stupid thing on saying that you're supposed to be done in 6 months to a year, when that's really the time when you can finally start.
Yes. Or when people say closure, right?
Yeah.
Closure is a real thing. It's what happens right before you begin to grieve. It's not the end of grief. It's the beginning of grief. When we have closure and find out who killed our son, or, find out that he really died, or whatever it is, that's when we can start grieving. That is not the end of grief. It is the beginning of grief.
So true. So true. We had our court for the woman who hit us about 10.5 months after the accident. I felt like after that day, I could start grieving.
Yes, exactly.
And I've got a friend of mine who is waiting court now, and it's been over a year since her son died. And the court is coming up soon. And I keep thinking in my mind, I'm so glad we're going to have this closure and you can put this person in prison. And now she'll be able to start.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly.
And I don't think the average person thinks that. I think the average person, probably friends of ours, because, we're in some of the same circles, so we have some of the same friends. I think they will think, oh, once this is done, she can kind of move on. But now she's been really very stuck, I think, unable to start grieving until this part is done. Yep. And when this part is done, now the work starts.
Yep. That's exactly right. And if people don't know that, right? The guilt again, I got closure. Why aren't I doing better? Right? Or why do I feel even worse?
Mm-hmm. So if you think about timing wise for me, this happened at the end of June in 2019. When was I able to start thinking about doing the podcast and all of that kind of I started to go to a healing mindset a little bit more, was after that, in August, in September. Until that point, I was stuck. I couldn't work. I couldn't do anything. And it wasn't really because I was grieving. It's because I couldn't even start grieving in many ways.
Yes.
So you have to get to that point. And obviously, I think it's different for different people. And for us, for both my friend and me, we had legal stuff that would stand in the way. That's not always the case, obviously. But there can be a lot of other things that can make it so you can't actually start.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. No, I think even knowing what all the aspects are, not that we all go through the same things in grief, or that we all go through at the same time frame, but the different aspects, like to watch out for guilt, to know that closure is not the end of grief, to know that there's layer upon layer of grief, that there's hundreds and hundreds of changes, like these major ones of change of our identity, and et cetera, et cetera. How in the world could you do all that in 6 months or a year? It's just too much, but we call it grief. Oh, the person's not here anymore. And that is the thing that hurts the most. But all of it's like, wait, let me give you a list of the 500 things that I have to deal with now and change. And then it becomes like, oh, I guess that would take a lot of time. That would be hard to do, right?
I've spoken to people recently too with the pandemic and unable to have like a funeral, celebration of life kind of thing. That they have not been able to start their grieving until they've been able to do that too. Or there are different things that can kind of be like, you have to be able to do some of those things and like, okay, now I can start.
Yes.
So I do want people to start thinking about it that way, is that there may be many steps you need to get through before you can say, now I can start grieving.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. That's absolutely positively true. And pandemic is, well, from the first week I called world grief. We've never experienced world grief before, where everyone was grieving at the same time, the entire planet. So that is also making grief more complex, even that in and of itself.
It is making grief more complex because those of us who have lost children or going through other things, then everyone, I think in some ways they're great, giving us a little more grace goes away, right? Because everyone's going through a hard time. So that can be a challenge in that too, that people sort of forget.
That's true too. You know, we all have less focus that we can give someone else when we're having to so focus on our own process.
Right, exactly. You don't have enough left.
There's just not enough
to give to other people. I have felt that a little bit at work sometimes. I feel like I'm quite drained myself, and then to have to keep giving can get overwhelming. And then I feel like I don't have anything left in the tank to give.
Yes.
So I need to try to fill myself up. So that is a hard thing about grieving in the pandemic, I think, because everyone's ability to give is not quite, at their normal level.
Absolutely. You certainly see it in a hospital community, right? With, the nurses and the doctors and everybody just oversaturated, and not only oversaturated with the physical work, which is enough in and of itself, but oversaturated emotionally, right? And, I mean, the whole planet needs a year of rest and relaxation at a spa.
Like that.
That's the kind of planet change I want.
That would be good.
With no new stuff coming in that we have to deal with and, put on our plates to process. That would be really nice.
Yeah, it's funny. My therapist had told me I had some time off of work, like a week and a half off of work, and like, okay, you need to do a lot of good self-care. And I went and then I go back to the office, like, how was your vacation? And I said, well, my grandma died. So my grandmother died, and then I had to go,
I'm so sorry
for the funeral, and I had all this stuff, and like, yeah, that was supposed to be my week and a half of self-care. Like, I mean, she lived a long life, but still, I grieve her, right?
Right. It's a different kind of grief, but it's still grief. And
it's still draining, and it still wasn't like a time that I refilled my.
You did not get a chance to refill. No. Right? No. They actually drained the cup a little bit there.
They did. That time I was supposed to be refilling, I drained a little bit more. But
I think it's a big thing being able to trust dealing with it myself. Working for myself, I've been working less because I don't want to be on overload.
Right. And
it's precious because burnout is a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we have no models for that in our culture, And as well as with grief, I've often told people it's a full-time job.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, when they're exhausted and they're like, oh my God, I can hardly work. Though a lot of people like to be at work because they get a little reprieve from their grief. It's a full-time job to grieve.
It is a full-time job. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's an exhausting thing. It needs to be honored and that we won't be in that wilderness forever. Our goal is to get to that overused term, new normal. But it's to the next place, which could be fantastic. We just have to get through that long journey in the wilderness to become that new person.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, we're becoming new people. I died when my son died. There's no two ways about it. But I kind of like my new person better than my old person.
Yeah.
She has more compassion and wisdom. And I don't feel like I did in the wilderness.
Yeah.
There really is hope. You're not supposed to be in acute grief forever. You are not supposed to be. And it doesn't mean you don't love your child if you don't get stuck. Because that happens to people too. I would be in that kind of pain. If I'm not, then I don't love them. That is not true. They would not want that. Guaranteed.
Yeah.
So, but it's a long journey, Bring
It
some
is.
snacks.
Bring some snacks. Go to a spa every once in a while. Get a massage.
I love my image of the whole world being a spa.
I do too. I think that's awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ninette. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. I feel like I could talk to you again and again and again.
Well,
Just
you're welcome to. And
glean
it was
more
really
wisdom.
really nice talking with you too.
I can see now why my friend said you have to have her on. She's
How
100%
sweet.
right.
How sweet. Well, nothing like another Larson,
I know. I should have you on again just for that. All right. Thank you so much.
Well, take care. Yes. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. If you found this helpful or would like to support the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating and comment. To help financially, you can text Andy's Mom to the number 53555 or visit the donate page on andysmom.com. Your donations are secure and tax deductible, and we are now able to accept Venmo, PayPal, and Apple Pay. Always Andy's Mom is a registered 501c3 organization and can receive donations through smile.amazon.com, Thrivent Financial, and Benevity, amongst others. Marcy loves hearing from listeners. Please feel free to reach out to her via email at marcy@andysmom.com. Also, be sure to sign up for the email list to receive weekly updates as well as pictures of all of Marcy's guests and their children. Together, let's work to inspire hope, one day at a time.